Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a country that has been fundamentally transformed by recent global crises and is now gearing up for a truly historic vote. We're talking about Sweden. A country historically famous for its robust welfare state, incredibly generous immigration policies, and its long-standing military non-alignment. Well, Sweden is standing at a major crossroads. On September 13th, 2026, citizens are heading to the polls. And as we're going to see, they're not just picking a prime minister. They're literally deciding the entire identity of Sweden for the 21st century. Okay, let's jump right in. To understand just how dramatic this election is, you have to look at this number. According to an August SVT and Varian poll commissioned by Reuters, the four center-left opposition parties are sitting on a massive 10-point lead over the ruling right-wing coalition. 10 points. That is a huge gap heading into an election, and it sets the stage for a very real possibility that the government could flip. But to understand why the voters are leaning this way, we really need to unpack the massive shifts that have hit the Swedish political landscape over the last few years. So, part one, a historic election in 2026 and the shifting landscape. To really get what's happening under Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson's current minority government, check out this timeline. For over 200 years, Sweden maintained strict military non-alignment. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, that identity vanished almost overnight. And that culminated in Sweden officially joining NATO in March 2024. This upcoming election is the very first one under this completely new reality. Suddenly, things like Baltic Sea security, fortifying the island of Gotland, and a massive expansion in civil defense are front and center. And what's super interesting here is that while domestic politics are fiercely divided, all 8 major parliamentary parties actually agree on supporting NATO and bumping up defense spending. But man, those domestic divisions are exactly where the drama is. Right now, Kristersson's government relies heavily on the far-right Sweden Democrats to maintain power, thanks to the Tito Agreement. And this brings us to something called the Sweden Promise from March 2026. Basically, if the right-wing bloc wins a majority this September, the Sweden Democrats could officially be granted cabinet positions. For a party that has historically never held a single cabinet seat, this would be an absolute earthquake in Swedish politics. Moving on to part two, the squeezed economy, and why everyday life just feels so expensive right now. Look, Sweden is deeply plugged into global supply chains, which means it's super vulnerable to inflation and energy shocks. Add to that the fact that Swedish households carry incredibly high private debt, and you get a massive squeeze on everyday purchasing power. And the human toll here is very real. By May 2026, Sweden's unemployment rate hit 9.4%. That is a really tough blow for working folks and the broader middle class. The government has tried expansive fiscal policies, even temporary VAT cuts on food, but they've struggled to get that number down. Naturally, job security is top of mind for voters. So, the million-dollar question: how do the parties actually plan to fix this? Well, we're seeing a classic ideological split. The ruling right-wing coalition, led by the moderates, is heavily focused on tax cuts and work incentives to jumpstart the economy. On the flip side, the center-left opposition, led by Magdalena Andersson's Social Democrats, argues that they need to raise taxes on high earners so they can rebuild and pour investments into public services, like schools and healthcare. And this exact tension sparked a really fiery moment during the televised party leader debates. Social Democrat leader Magdalena Andersson basically called out Prime Minister Kristersson and Sweden Democrat leader Jimmy Åkesson, pointing out that they had just lowered their own taxes by 6,000 kronor. She then went after the Liberals' promise to halve the state income tax, claiming it would personally give the Prime Minister a 15,000 kronor tax cut. Kristersson snapped back, visibly irritated, accusing her of only ever talking about what party leaders get. It's a fiercely personalized fight over who is actually benefiting from these economic policies. All right, part 3, the deepening housing crisis, which is honestly turning into a massive generational squeeze. Now, it's important to note that the housing market isn't completely broken everywhere in Sweden, but in major hubs like Stockholm and Gothenburg, it is incredibly tight. We're talking severe bottlenecks, skyrocketing construction costs, and really strict rent controls. As this European Commission report points out, young people are essentially locked out. They can't afford to buy, and the queues for primary rentals are decades long. So vulnerable groups and students get forced into an unprotected, incredibly expensive secondary subletting market. The raw data on overcrowding from that EU report is genuinely wild. Look at this. The general population sits at about 16.7% for living in overcrowded homes, which is near the EU average. But for folks at risk of poverty, that jumps to 42.3%.
And for non-EU-born residents, a staggering 47% live in overcrowded conditions. That's nearly half. It's clear that this housing crisis disproportionately hits marginalized communities, which feeds right back into the country's broader issues with segregation.
Which leads us perfectly into part 4, migration and crime, and a total paradigm shift. So for decades, Sweden was globally renowned for having some of the most generous humanitarian immigration policies in the world, peaking during the 2015 migration wave. But over time, serious integration struggles and growing segregation led to a complete 180. The current government, driven by their pact with the Sweden Democrats, has instituted some incredibly drastic measures. As of July 2026, permanent residency for recognized asylum seekers is gone, replaced by temporary 5-year permits. They also passed a highly controversial good conduct law that can revoke permits for misbehavior. And public employees are now actually legally mandated to report anyone who lacks residence rights.
The debate over where to go from here is heated, but the entire political center of gravity has shifted to the right. The Sweden Democrats want even stricter immigration and total assimilation. The moderates want strict migration tied to tough employment mandates. But here's the crazy part. Even the Social Democrats have moved toward a significantly stricter position than they held just a decade ago, now prioritizing controlled borders alongside integration. Really, only the Green and Left parties are still pushing for a return to a more humanitarian approach, warning that these new rules are targeting vulnerable minorities. All of this is deeply intertwined with a really shocking rise in gang violence, shootings, and even explosions across Sweden. And this leaves voters with a profound question. Can tougher punishments and expanded police powers, which the right is championing, actually solve the gang epidemic? Or, as the left argues, do you have to address the root social conditions, the housing segregation, and the welfare gaps that allow these criminal networks to recruit teenagers in the first place?
Part 5. Welfare, Security, and Climate. Ultimately, how do we fund the future?
At the core of this whole election is the survival of the famous Swedish model. Can it handle an aging population, huge regional disparities, and frustratingly long healthcare waiting times? Here, the ideological divide over equality is stark. The Left Party is proposing something quite radical, completely banning private profits in welfare sectors like schools and clinics to protect public resources. The center-right, however, strongly pushes back, arguing that you need a pro-business environment, market reforms, and private sector efficiency to keep things running. And then, of course, we have the climate and the energy grid. Sweden's industries desperately need massive electrification, but right now, voters are feeling the sting of very high electricity prices. The Green Party's vision is built on heavy state investment in green jobs and a rapid, massive expansion of wind and solar power. The right, on the other hand, argues that relying on the wind and sun isn't enough, and that a strong, reliable expansion of nuclear power is the absolute only way to secure Sweden's industrial future. Part 6. The political divide. What do these parties actually want? When you step back, the divide in this election isn't just a simple left loves welfare, right loves tax cuts cartoon. It really boils down to a fundamental philosophical question. How much should the state be expected to provide for you, and how much should you, as an individual, be responsible to pay for yourself? That is the choice in front of the voters. Will market reforms, a return to nuclear power, tougher prison sentences, and strict assimilation mandates secure the country's future? Or does the answer lie in heavy welfare investments, green energy, taxing high earners, and treating the social roots of crime? I mean, which approach is actually going to fix the bottlenecks in the housing market and pull that 9.4% unemployment rate down? Which brings us to our final thought. The parties completely disagree on the solutions, but the problems, those are shared by pretty much everyone. Whether you're in downtown Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö, or a tiny rural town, the high prices, the housing shortages, the healthcare waits, and the genuine fear of gang violence are touching every corner of the country. So when Swedes vote on September 13th, they aren't just choosing between Magdalena Andersson and Ulf Kristersson. They are voting on the very definition of the Swedish model in a completely changed world. What kind of country do they want to be? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on Sweden this September.